There's a disease so rare doctors only discovered it by accident. It has no cure, no treatment, and exactly one symptom that sounds almost harmless. You stop being able to sleep. Not tired eyes, not a few rough nights. You simply stop sleeping, permanently, and your body starts shutting down in a way medicine still doesn't fully understand. It's called fatal familial insomnia, and less than 50 families on Earth are known to carry it. If you've never heard of it, that's not an accident. This is one of the strangest, most misunderstood diseases in medical history, and the story of how we found it is almost as unsettling as the disease itself. Here's how it usually starts. A person in their late 40s or 50s begins having trouble falling asleep. Nothing dramatic at first. A little insomnia, some anxiety, maybe some sweating at night. Doctors, if they're consulted at all, usually suggest stress, or aging, or a mild sleep disorder. But within weeks, something stranger happens. The person stops being able to enter deep sleep at all. Not shallow sleep, not restless sleep, no sleep whatsoever, at any depth, for the rest of their life. As the weeks pass, the body begins to show signs of catastrophic stress. Blood pressure spikes, heart rate climbs, body temperature becomes erratic. The person begins to panic, to hallucinate, to lose the ability to distinguish waking thought from dreaming thought, because without deep sleep, the brain never gets to properly separate the two. Eventually, they enter a state doctors describe as a waking coma, technically conscious, but no longer able to meaningfully interact with the world. Death usually comes within 6 to 36 months of the first symptom. There is no recovery. There has never been a documented survivor. The disease was formally identified in 1986, but its true origin traces back much further, to a physician in Venice named Ignazio Roiter. In the 1980s, Roiter began treating a patient with these exact symptoms, and he noticed something the man mentioned almost in passing. Several of his relatives had died the same way. Roiter started digging into the family's history, and what he found stretched back over 200 years. Death records, old physician notes, family letters, all describing the same pattern across generations. Restlessness, sweating, sleeplessness that never resolved. Then death, usually within a year or two of the first symptoms appearing. Roiter eventually traced the family's affected lineage back to a physician who died in Venice in 1836, a man believed to be the earliest documented case. For nearly 150 years, this family had been quietly losing members to a disease with no name, no diagnosis, and no explanation, passed down like a curse nobody could see coming until it was already happening. For generations, some family members reportedly refused to even discuss it directly, referring to it only in vague terms, a private inheritance nobody asked for and nobody could return. In 1986, after the patient Roiter had been treating died, his family agreed to something remarkable. They allowed his brain to be studied after death, specifically a structure called the thalamus, the part of the brain responsible for regulating sleep. What researchers found stunned them. The thalamus was riddled with holes, a spongy, damaged tissue pattern that looked almost like Swiss cheese under a microscope. This particular kind of brain damage put fatal familial insomnia into a category of diseases most people have heard of in a very different context: prion diseases. The same category as mad cow disease and its human variant, creutzfeldt-jakob disease, and an older disease called kuru. Once found among a tribe in Papua New Guinea whose funeral rituals involved consuming the tissue of the deceased, unknowingly spreading the same kind of misfolded protein between the living and the dead. Here's what makes prion diseases so strange and so frightening to the scientists who study them. A prion isn't a virus. It isn't a bacteria. It isn't even alive in any conventional sense. It's a misfolded protein, a molecule that's supposed to have one shape, but instead has folded into a different, dysfunctional shape. And here's the part that still unsettles researchers decades later. A misfolded prion protein can force normal, healthy proteins nearby to also misfold, simply by touching them. It's less like an infection and more like a kind of molecular corruption spreading through contact, protein by protein, until enough of the thalamus is destroyed that sleep becomes physically impossible. In fatal familial insomnia specifically, This misfolding happens because of a single genetic mutation on a gene called PRNP, which provides the blueprint for a protein called PRP. Unlike mad cow disease or kuru, which can potentially spread through contaminated tissue, fatal familial insomnia is purely hereditary. Nobody catches it. You're either born with the mutation or you aren't. If a parent carries it, each child has a 50% chance of inheriting it, the same odds as a coin flip, decided once at conception and then carried silently for decades. And if they inherit it, the disease is not a possibility, it's a certainty. There is no known case of someone carrying the mutation and not eventually developing symptoms. It generally activates sometime between the ages of 30 and 60, meaning a person can live decades not knowing whether they're carrying a genetic switch that will eventually turn off their ability to sleep entirely. This creates one of the cruelest positions in all of medicine. Family members who know the disease runs in their bloodline face an almost impossible decision. Genetic testing exists. You can find out, with certainty, whether you carry the mutation years or decades before any symptoms would appear. Some choose to find out so they can plan, have children through other means, or simply live with clarity instead of dread. Others choose never to find out at all, because if there's no cure and no treatment, what does the knowledge actually give you, besides watching a clock you can't stop? Genetic counselors who work with these families describe both choices as equally rational, which is part of what makes the disease so psychologically brutal. There is no wrong answer, because there's no good one available. In the early 2000s, one of the most quietly devastating cases of fatal familial insomnia was documented by neurologist and journalist D.T. Max, who spent years researching the disease and interviewing affected families for his book on the subject. He described watching family members literally count the years until the age their parent had been when symptoms first appeared, treating each passing birthday as a kind of survival milestone. Some described a strange, dark relief in developing symptoms early, because at least then the waiting itself was finally over. One family member Max interviewed described the mutation not as a disease exactly, but as a kind of inherited appointment, one you couldn't cancel and didn't get to choose the date of. There is currently no cure, and no way to reliably slow the disease once it begins. Researchers have tried sleep medications, sedatives, even induced comas, and none of it works, because the problem isn't a lack of opportunity to sleep. The physical machinery required to enter deep sleep has been destroyed. You cannot medicate your way into a function that no longer physically exists in the brain. But there is one detail in this story that quietly changes how you might think about it. In 1997, doctors in Chicago tried something new. A patient with fatal familial insomnia was placed into a medically induced coma before symptoms could fully progress, specifically to try to protect the brain from the cardiovascular stress the disease usually causes. It didn't cure him. It didn't stop the underlying protein damage, but he lived nearly a year longer than doctors expected, and for a brief window near the beginning, before the coma, family members said he seemed calmer than he had been in months, simply because, for the first time since his diagnosis, no one was asking him to try to sleep. That detail matters more than it might seem, because so much of what makes this disease unbearable isn't only the physical deterioration, it's the awareness. Watching your own mind fail to do something as basic as rest, night after night, while fully conscious of what's happening and what it means. Most people who die of illness eventually lose awareness before the end. Fatal familial insomnia takes that mercy away. You're present for nearly all of it, which is part of why researchers who study the disease describe it less like a physical illness and more like a slow, involuntary vigil. And this is where the story reaches past the disease itself, into something closer to the rest of us. We treat sleep as optional. Something to push against, cut short, override with caffeine and willpower and one more hour of work. An entire culture has built itself around treating exhaustion as a badge of honor. But sleep isn't a lifestyle choice your body tolerates. It's structural. It's the process your brain uses to physically clear out waste, consolidate memory, regulate mood, and reset the systems that keep you alive. Fatal familial insomnia is what happens when that process is completely removed, and it shows, in the most extreme and tragic way possible, that sleep was never the optional part of being human. It was the foundation the rest of you was quietly built on top of. Somewhere in northern Italy, there are still families living with this mutation today. Some who know, some who have chosen not to. They wake up every morning the same as anyone else, go to work, raise children, live ordinary lives, carrying a switch inside them that may never turn on, or may turn on decades from now, on a night that looks like any other night. Researchers continue to study these families closely, in part because understanding fatal familial insomnia may eventually help explain other prion diseases too, including forms of dementia that affect a far larger number of people worldwide. The next time you lie awake at 2 a.m., annoyed at your own brain for not shutting off, it might be worth remembering that somewhere, for a small number of families, that shutting off is the one thing their bodies can no longer promise them at all.